US pump prices are up nearly $1 year on year. But on Sunday, Trump kept celebrating the US's 250th birthday by driving around the Indy car racetrack in his presidential limousine. The same day, his team announced an economic D-Day that threatens to surge oil prices back to wartime highs. When US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent laid out Operation Economic Outcast against Iran, he told the world, "You are either with us or against us." It's a binary that echoes George W. Bush's War on Terror speech. Bessent also likened his ploy to the historic D-Day landings of World War II.
In the Second World War, D-Day marked the historic beginning of a campaign with our allies to target and drive the enemy from its positions, including those in third countries. Today, in that same spirit, we are launching an economic onslaught against Iran's financial connections around the globe.
What does this look like? 5 new sectors of Iran's economy will be sanctioned: digital assets, tech, gold, aviation and shipping. On top of that, third countries are now on the chopping block. Every country has to cut ties with Iran, or the US says it will sanction them. China is the elephant in the room. Beijing buys the majority of Iranian oil, though imports have slipped over the course of the war. China's big state refiners, which use the US dollar-based international financial system, have been wary of US sanctions in the past, while its domestic teapot refineries are steadfast Iranian buyers. But China's foreign ministry rejected unilateral sanctions, saying Beijing would do what was necessary to protect its own interests. Iran also hit back, warning not a single drop of oil will leave the Gulf. And Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi dismissed Trump's D-Day as nothing new, saying the US cannot think of any other strategies against Iran. Iran's theocratic government has withstood US sanctions for 47 years, but its people face inflation rates near 90%, and the rial plummeted in value on Monday, hitting a record low rate of 2.02 million to the dollar. So is Trump's D-Day an attack of historic proportions or an administration out of ideas? I'm joined now by Sinna Tusi, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington. Sinna, welcome back to the show. What do you think? Is this a serious turning point in the war, or the same old strategy in shiny new packaging?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I think, Bennett's speech yesterday was very vague on details. The United States, as you mentioned, has had major economic sanctions, really unparalleled economic sanctions against Iran for many years, especially this Trump administration. Trump, in his first term, when he left the Obama-era nuclear deal, he imposed this so-called maximum pressure campaign, which has held on throughout all these years against Iran. Biden did not reverse it. And Trump doubled down, before these wars, before this past war, before the June 2025 war, Trump had escalated sanctions even more. So the Iranian economy, when it comes to U.S. primary and secondary sanctions meaning the U.S. economic threats against other countries, third parties, international companies that do business with Iran, that they'll be barred from the U.S. market. These sanctions have basically turned Iran's economy out of the normal international system. And now these new measures that Bessent announced yesterday, again, it's vague on the details, but it seems like what the U.S. is going to do is double down on secondary sanctions, double down on the trade that Iran has been able to commit to, and basically has allowed it to survive with neighboring countries, with China, and to the end that it's going to be successful in undermining those relationships. It seems very unclear, and I think unlikely, given that the U.S. basically has very little leverage with other countries, and this was a war that nobody else in the world outside of Israel wanted.
Sina, you argued in Foreign Policy earlier this month that Mojtaba Khamenei's leadership is preparing for a long war, essentially planning for exactly the US strategy just announced. How do you know? What preparations are you seeing?
Yeah, so Iran's kind of deterrence posture, its approach to foreign policy, to U.S. escalations, had been arguably in the run-up to these wars, throughout this maximum pressure campaign I just described, relatively restrained. And Iran was, for the longest time, quite calibrated in its counter-escalations. And that, I think, really contributed to a perception in Washington and Tel Aviv that Iran was weak, was a paper tiger, and led to this war. Now we're seeing after, during this war and with the opening blows and the assassination of the Supreme Leader Khamenei, that Iran obviously became much more assertive. It quickly regionalized the costs of the war, the Strait of Hormuz closure. And now we're seeing with these appointments, and in this piece I wrote for Foreign Policy that you mentioned, these appointments by this new Supreme Leader to Iran's top national security posts, the military, various military commands, the statements that were accompanied by these appointments from Mojtaba Khamenei, it really shows that Iran is doubling down on this more assertive deterrence posture, meaning that it wants to take the initiative more. It is willing to go on the offense. They're even mentioning going on the offense, kind of preemptive strikes. I don't think this doesn't mean that Iran wants more war or is trying to basically elongate this war, but that they're really, I think, trying to correct in their telling this miscalculation that the U.S. had about Iran, and are willing to regionalize the costs of conflict with Iran even further. And I think in regards to this new economic campaign that Bessent is announcing, what the Iranians are saying as part of this new posture is that Iran is basically not going to sit silently. The adversary always gets a say, and this Mohsen Rezai, the new head of the Iranian National Security Council, has said that if other countries are going to go along with this new economic warfare against Iran, that Iran will basically attack them. I mean, he worded it diplomatically. He said the first Iran is going to negotiate with them. He's going to give them time, basically, try to convince them not to go along with the U.S. approach. But if not, that Iran is willing to further regionalize the cost. And he also said something Iranian officials have said for a long time: if Iran can't export oil, then basically no one can export oil. And I think the war kind of bore out that these threats by Iran aren't hollow, that Iran can follow through. It has followed through, and I think they're trying to basically deter more escalation with this kind of rhetoric.
But in this deterrent strategy, the hand that Israel has to play is essentially the global economy. Now, in his speech, Scott Bessent conceded the US doesn't want to blow up the global financial system. Iran appears less concerned about this. How long would it take to reach a level of global economic collapse that would force the US to back down? And also, who pays the highest price in this scenario?
Right now, overall, in this stage of this US-Iran conflict, there's basically two clocks that are winding down. Now, for the Iranians, the clock that's winding down for them is this US blockade, or is these intensified economic measures that are impacting the Iranian economy. As you said, the Iranian economy has long been under extraordinary strain because of U.S. sanctions, and now that strain is intensifying. But the clock that's winding down for the U.S. is the continued disruption of the Strait of Hormuz. I think despite, a lot of statements from the Trump administration, and, a large part of this is their own psychological warfare, trying to present the strait as kind of open now or under U.S. control. I mean, that is a very strong exaggeration, including as we know through a lot of these companies that do the tracking, like Kepler or Windward and other companies, that, the transit through the strait is still very small compared to what it was before the war. And this is having mounting economic costs for the global economy, especially when it comes to fuels, like gasoline or diesel or jet fuel. And so I think that's the clock that's winding down for the U.S. and, inflation in the U.S. ahead of the midterms. So right now, each side is trying to see, trying to get the other side to blink first. Now, I think interestingly, we did have, the Pakistani Field Marshal Asif Munir went to Iran just yesterday. The Omanis are there today as well. They're trying to negotiate this new agreement with Iran. So we'll have to see, if a diplomatic off-ramp is in the game right now, if that's viable right now. I think Iran wants it, but on its terms. And I don't see any sign that Iran is backing off from its negotiating positions, namely that it wants a kind of new governance over the Strait of Hormuz, a new governance model, and it wants sanctions relief.
And I suppose Oman as well. Oman, as you point out, is meeting with Tehran today to discuss shipping regulation in the Hormuz Strait. Surely that is not what the US is wanting from Oman. Is that an indicator that Oman doesn't seem to be backing down in the face of these sanctions? Do they stand to lose in the face of these sanctions?
Well, it's very interesting because Oman has kind of been a bystander to all this. I mean, Oman was the main mediator between the U.S. and Iran in the lead up to both this war and the war last summer. Actually, just in the lead up to this war in February, the Omani foreign minister did a last ditch kind of effort to prevent war and did the rounds on the U.S. kind of Sunday morning shows late February saying that a deal was basically at hand. But, the U.S. overplayed its hand and wanted total regime change or collapse in Iran, and has resulted in this quagmire. But right now, Oman is the kind of state that shares the sea border with the Hormuz Straits with Iran. And so they're trying to negotiate a new regime for the governance of the strait, where Iran wants much more control. It wants institutionalized control. It wants to say who gets in, who gets out. And I think Iran wants this because it wants lasting leverage. Because if there is a deal, Iran is not expecting or hinging its hopes on the U.S. abiding by its commitments on sanctions relief. But if it controls Hormuz, if it can control what ships go in and out, it gives it kind of a lasting lever to prevent, further coercion against it in the future. Now, the Omanis it's interesting because Oman is part of the GCC. It's a U.S. ally, and it's a weak state, relative to Iran and the U.S., obviously. So I have a hard time believing that Oman would be agreeing to anything as significant as a new legal regime over Hormuz without the U.S. green light. Now, Trump has been threatening Oman. He's threatened to bomb Oman. But I think, there is signs that Oman is still in some kind of mediating capacity between the U.S. and Iran, with Pakistan as well. And we'll have to see if they do reach this new kind of scheme, they call it, between Iran and Oman for transit in the Hormuz Strait. We'll have to see if the U.S. welcomes that, if it doesn't welcome that. And if it doesn't welcome that, is the U.S. going to be on a kind of conflict footing with Oman? Because that'll have huge strategic ramifications for the Persian Gulf, for the GCC, and, for the U.S. kind of role in this region.
Now, it's clear there are holes in the US strategy here. It's more sanctions on 47 years of sanctions. But there is also clearly a debate inside Iran between the hardliners and figures like President Pezeshkian. Pezeshkian has said the country cannot continue with war forever. How does this internal rift impact Iran's ability to withstand hardship and also to confidently impose costs on everyone around them?
Yeah, so, I think a lot of the rhetoric coming from Iran, from President Pezeshkian, from Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, has been pretty consistent. I mean, they've consistently talked about the economic costs of war, trying to reduce them for the people of Iran, and yet talking about they're not going to basically capitulate to maximalist U.S. demands. Even Pezeshkian, in the same speech that he said, what you just referenced, he also talked about Iran not surrendering its dignity and honor and not giving into, all these things that the U.S. wants. So I think it's more nuanced, that this idea that there is a major rift. I think when it comes to their core negotiating bottom lines, that's what we really have to track. I mean, there was an MOU that was signed between the U.S. and Iran that Iran says the U.S. didn't abide by its commitments to release Iran's frozen assets, to have the Iranian arrangements for Hormuz transit, and to end the regional war, including in Lebanon. Those are things that this MOU explicitly said. So I think in Iran there is unity that there basically needs to be a return to this MOU. This time the U.S. needs to fully abide by its commitments, including releasing Iranian frozen assets up front. And we'll have to see if the Iranians back down from that or not, but I don't see any evidence that they are, including through this recent rhetoric by the parliamentary speaker Ghalibaf, who's been the head of the negotiations with the U.S., or from the reformers President Pezeshkian. And certainly it's not reflected in these new military and national security shifts that are more hardline figures.
Is that unity in the bottom line? Is that translating down to ordinary Iranians? I mean, inflation in Iran is near 90% year on year. The currency is at a record low as of Monday, and reporting from inside Iran describes people buying food on credit. Can the government impose these costs on its own population indefinitely?
Yeah, well, the Iranian people have certainly borne the brunt of these pressures. And I think the US is actually betting a lot. And this has been a continuous part of its strategy to create domestic unrest and to translate that into pressure against the government or trying to topple the government. I mean, this war was explicitly launched with Trump calling on the Iranian people to rise up, amid protests that happened in Iran in the months prior and the brutal government crackdown of those protests in January. But we saw the war, one major effect it did have in Iranian society, which is a polarized society, that there was a rally around the flag effect, not necessarily only behind the government, but behind, defense of the homeland. Certainly the Islamic Republic social base was mobilized and has been in the streets for many months now in major cities and major squares. And even beyond that, I would argue that large parts of Iranian society, this kind of rally around the flag, defending of the country, that was very pronounced. But these pressures are real. They're creating more pressure on the Iranian people. I think that is translating into demands that Iran can't afford to continue this in perpetuity. And there needs to be a diplomatic deal. And I think, a lot of these politicians there, like Pezeshkian, convey that. But again, I think when it comes to the bottom line, and especially it's like, what is the option that Iran is being given? Because, Trump was talking about supporting, Kurdish invasion from Western Iran. He bombed a lot of infrastructure in Iran, from schools to universities to bridges. So for the most Iranian people, despite all their discontent internally, when they see these kind of foreign attacks aimed at really tearing the country apart pretty brazenly and openly from Trump, it's still going to make them hesitate to take to the streets and become part and parcel with potentially an agenda that's aimed at kind of destroying their country.